Hi everyone, I'm Nick and this is Alasdair. We're here to do our set review for the Canadian Highlander format for the Shadows over Innistrad set.
It's an exciting looking set.
Yeah, the flavor's amazing.
Double face cards, and this first card that we're starting off with, Avison, is an excellent example of just how much story they can fit into a single card.
Yeah, I think they did a great job with the set in general.
Yeah, it's. I'm looking forward to it a lot.
So we're going to go in color order. We're going to dive in here with white. And here's the Avison, the Archangel Avison.
Double face cards always a little hard to evaluate on first blush, just because there's so much going on in each one.
Do you count on being able to flip it every time, or do you just evaluate it based on the front half and assume it's going to be bonus if you flip it?
If we judge this card just on its front half, it's better than Sarah Angel. Well, Sarah Angel obviously not good enough to see play. A lot rides on how useful the flash and the combat trick ability are.
So to me, the flash is what actually makes this card super playable. I know it's 5 mana, but I think it's in Restoration Angel territory. Not as good as Resto Angel because it doesn't have the ETB effect reuse that Resto gives you.
It does have the same protection effect that Resto gives you. Often you Resto
Exactly.
in response to a removal spell. Avison accomplishes the same thing.
So it's going to have that, and honestly, just having another flash creature in those decks that want to save their mana until your end of turn, that's a big deal. So it's a flash threat, and it's a flash threat that's often going to be a serious threat, 6 power threat with the ability to clear the board.
Quite frankly, I think that you're mostly going to want to play her in a deck that doesn't have lots of other creatures. I don't think you're looking to maximize her indestructible effect, because you don't. After the turn she comes into play, you don't have control over when she flips.
Yeah.
And when she flips, she deals 3 damage to all your creatures as well. So
Play this in decks without too many creatures, but that do want
instant
a flash,
speed finisher.
Yeah, a finisher, end of turn. It's not crazy good, but I think it's playable.
Speaking of not crazy good, obviously any white removal spell that's ever printed for Highlander has to be the 3rd or 4th or 5th removal spell that you're playing in colors, and this has a lot of stern competition. It is flexible in the same way that Maelstrom Pulse or Engineered Explosives can sweep an entire board of tokens.
Yeah,
So,
but
has
that
some
doesn't,
utility.
doesn't come up that often. Honestly, just the fact that this gives an upside to your opponent, it has a strict downside over Journey to Nowhere, and it's a sorcery speed just like Journey to Nowhere. And it's been years since I've actually played Journey to Nowhere. There's always better options. I don't think this gets into any white deck.
It's going to be amazing in Standard, but the competition for white removal in Highlander is just so high.
Too high.
Is there a human deck yet?
They've been printing more and more human tribal cards, and it's just a matter of time. And maybe it's there already. I don't know.
This is the thing with enablers for strategies that don't exist. Is you get enough of them, the strategy's going to exist eventually.
Yeah.
Is now the time.
Start taking it more seriously, but yeah, this needs testing.
So this seems like a pretty strong way for white to get card advantage in the deck that wants to play lots of small creatures.
But does the deck that wants to play lots of small creatures have 2 mana to sacrifice its clues? Is it actually going to get that card advantage?
Clues are another interesting element of this set that are somewhat difficult to evaluate.
Right, because it doesn't require you to have 2 mana at any specific time. It requires you to ever have 2 extra mana.
That's the difficulty with Mentor of the Meek, is it costs 1 mana to draw a card every time you cast a creature, which is great, but it tacks 1 mana onto the mana cost of every creature you play.
Right, you often can't afford it at that exact moment.
However, I think it's fair to say that most white weenie decks are either going to have a lot of creatures and things to do all the time, or they're going to run out of gas at some point. And when they run out of gas, they have mana lying around. Is tapping out on your last turn to draw 2 cards good enough?
I think that first and foremost in a white aggressive deck, we need to be looking at the stats, and this comes up way too short on the stats, even if it does draw some cards. Speaking of white weenie,
Yeah.
This is a bear with quite an upside.
There's quite a lot of upside on this bear.
It just starts as a bear, but then it turns into
At least a 4/4.
big old creature.
4/4, which makes itself bigger and gives you more creatures.
Its flip side is just so rad and so exciting that I think you're willing to play a vanilla 2-mana 2/2.
Also, great in the human tribal deck.
Just saying. And this is the one that all the white weenie players are super excited about, I think. If you're not excited about it, the reason why you should be is that it's already good as a 1-mana 1/1 flyer that taps something down. That's already just great.
Yep.
And that is one great way to evaluate a Delirium card is, would you play it without the Delirium? An aggressive deck is not going to hit the Delirium that often. But if you do, that's really exciting.
Hello.
Hello. So this is a card I think you're excited about.
Everyone is telling me that I'm excited about it, but really, 5 mana for counter a spell is not very flexible. It only does the one thing, and it costs 5 mana to do it. Wow. That's just... Don't shoehorn me like that. Like, a control deck doesn't want to be stuck with, like, my plan is to wait until you cast a spell now. It's not an answer. It's so expensive.
Clue tokens are a slow way to gain card advantage, and quite frankly, I think that the best cards that investigate are the cards that are not in blue, because blue already has so many good ways to draw cards that waiting around and spending extra mana is not necessary. I mean, compare this to Mystic Confluence that can...
Well, that's an unfair comparison, because Mystic Confluence is just crazy bonkers good. But
in Highlander, you have to be comparable to the crazy bonkers good cards.
Mystic Confluence is good because it can deal with the threat already on the board, and it is good when they're not casting any spells. And those are two scenarios that come up all the time. This is only good when they're casting a spell and you have 5 mana open, and that is just way too narrow. Forget the clues. It's just already terrible at that point. In Gulf of Shore, on the other hand, you obviously need to be playing a lot of islands, but
you're gonna, if you're playing a lot of islands, you're gonna bounce a lot of creatures.
It's the most efficient mass bounce spell ever printed. That's not saying a lot, because they've never printed a playable mass bounce spell.
Instant speed is really nice on this one.
Although it's the most powerful mass bounce spell ever printed, I still don't think it makes the cut. I'd rather just kill those creatures somehow. I don't know.
Well, we'll see. Exciting tentacle monsters, that's for sure.
I say no. So this card's been getting hype.
People have been very excitedly telling me how good this card is.
Comparing it to Fact or Fiction.
People need to compare this card to Steam Augury, which is a card you don't know exists because it doesn't get played in Highlander because it's terrible.
Yeah, this is Steam Augury.
This is
It's
Steam Augury.
just the same card as Steam Augury.
Yeah, you can play it for different amounts of mana, but that doesn't make it any less terrible.
Play Stroke of Genius. If you want an X-Spell to draw cards, play Blue Sun Zenith. This card is not going to give you the card you want, by definition.
Yeah.
And don't tell me that maybe your opponent will make a mistake. That is a terrible way to play Magic, counting on your opponents to make mistakes.
If your deck is the kind of deck that always has the 2 best cards you need in the top 5, then sure, that in that Magical Christmas land, this card is pretty decent. But if you're ever in a situation where you need to draw a particular card, this just is never going to get you that.
Yeah. So this card is going to need some unraveling of its own.
I feel like they've been doing a lot. Their early Planeswalkers all had a very specific niche, and they did crazy, interesting, unique effects, and now they've realized how long the game is going to last. They're sort of exploring into the very vanilla Planeswalker territory, like Obnixilis Reignited.
Yeah.
I feel like Jace is very comparable to Obnixilis just in terms of boring plus ability that draws you a card, boring minus ability that affects the board. The draw is better, the creature effect is worse. I don't think that it's an amazing Planeswalker, but in a deck that already has all the amazing Planeswalkers, it's a...
If you need another Planeswalker, this is the best 5-mana Jace that they've made. Ugh.
Scry 1, draw a card is quite nice. I mean, you obviously
It's
need to
nice.
be able to
Yeah.
defend it. He's not very good at defending himself on a full board, but
Yeah.
if your deck just needs more 5-mana ways to dirtle around and draw cards, he's pretty good at dirtling.
It's something to consider, but it's not an exciting include. So this is a card that could only ever possibly be good in the Tolarian Academy combo deck. So just as a reminder,
This is snuck out of Urza's block.
yeah, so that deck relies on getting Tolarian Academy in play and generating tons and tons of mana with it. It has several ways to untap Tolarian Academy. It has 2 lands that untap it, and it plays Frantic Search, which is 3 mana, draw 2, discard 2, untap 3 lands. So normally that would net you 0 mana, but with Tolarian Academy in play, it often nets you 6 or even 8 mana. So various builds of that deck have played other cards with that mechanic, like Rewind or Snap.
And really, you only need to untap 2 lands. You untap the Academy and you untap the Minamo if you have it. That's all you need. So the fact that this costs 5 but untaps 2 doesn't really eat into your mana.
It looks like it's going to cost you 3. Actually, in the Tolarian Academy deck, once you're going off, it's probably still going to actually gain you 6 mana or something like that. The deck already plays some pretty subpar sorceries that draw you cards. It requires a lot of those to function. So this is a card that already goes in the deck and just has this amazing ability tacked on that's way overpowered in that deck. It's a very exciting include, and it's subtle to see it, but I'm very, very happy for the Tolarian Academy deck to receive 4 of the pages.
Do you think that this is good enough to be considered in a High Tide deck? Because you're getting less value.
High Tide is very, very tight.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the cards it needs to have in it are... It's so finely tuned and finely balanced. And for that reason, I think we have to talk to a High Tide player, honestly.
Yeah.
It's a specialist opinion.
It's something to consider. Please don't play this in a deck if your lands aren't tapping for 3 mana.
Or 5 mana.
Or 8 mana.
Yeah. It's only really good in those scenarios. But yeah. So this is a really simple little creature. Don't get confused by all the text. It basically is a 2-mana 2/1 flying flash. And like I was saying earlier, flash creatures, especially flash creatures with evasion, are a really special thing. There's a lot of decks that are trying to hold up mana and also cast threats. Vendilion Click is super powerful, not for its discard ability, but for its flash. And so this card is good just for that.
Also, great in the Spirit tribal deck.
Who knows? Is that a deck yet? This is my pick for number 1 best card of the set, and I personally am just like crazy excited about it. Please trade me one at the pre-release tomorrow.
I feel like it should be noted that this deck this card doesn't necessarily go in every deck that's going to want to try and jam it.
No, it's not for every blue deck, definitely.
Yeah. It's worse later in the game if you draw it. You need to be having a deck where you both want a wall that can protect you against early aggro and be confident you're going to cast enough non-wrath instants and sorceries that you'll get around to flipping it. That being said, if you have those criteria, and decks do, you get a lot of upside for being able to break this thing out of the ice.
Yeah, that's a lot of upside.
That's a lot of upside.
This card is already okay. Just a 2-mana 0/4 is not the end of the world for a blue-white control deck.
Mm-hmm.
That's necessary. You need some walls to survive the early game, because spot removal in blue-white is a little bit hard to come by. The upside is huge, and you will get there if you draw it early.
Yeah.
So this card is just super, super exciting and fun.
Also, great in the horror tribal deck. Yeah, so this card is great.
Doesn't require much discussion. Its stats are already good.
It's obviously nuts in any black aggressive deck. Not necessarily beating out Bob, but filling in the same kind of slot as Bob.
There have been a lot of imitation Bobs, but this one's the real deal.
Yeah. Quite frankly, I think that this card is good enough to also see play in other black-based decks that aren't
Very
aggro.
possibly.
The fact that it triggers on each player's upkeep means that you get the opportunity to draw cards even when you have cards in your hand. You know, black is good at taking cards out of other people's hands. And because it triggers only on Hellbent, you have control over it. As someone who plays a lot of Phyrexian Arenas and plays against a lot of aggro decks, Phyrexian Arena is often a completely dead card against an aggressive deck where you just can't afford to take that risk.
Yeah.
Asylum Visitor fills a very nice niche of being able to be played, traded with a creature, and if you don't want to lose the life, you can just hold a land in your hand, and you have a lot of control with this card, so I think that it's got a good home in more decks than just the obvious black aggro.
It's great. We feel like we had to mention this one because it seems like it might go in Storm.
Yeah, I mean, Storm casts Demonic Consultation for 5 and 5 X.
Yeah.
So it's spending 8 mana to get 3 cards into his hand. This is 7 mana for 3 cards in his hand.
And oftentimes it's getting just 3 cards that'll win the game on their own.
Storm
gets relying on cards already in the hand.
If Storm gets a tutor its deck for 3 cards, it wins the game. So this is another card that lets it do that.
Yeah. So, here you go. A free gift.
So this is good in the Vampire Tribal deck. We don't know if that's a thing either.
Is that a thing yet?
But there's a bunch of good Vampire cards in this deck, in this block as well. So if it wasn't before, you might want to consider having a look at it again.
This is reasonable stats.
Yeah, I mean,
2-power evasion, yeah.
2-power evasion, like people, the mono black deck sometimes plays just the 2 mana 2-power flyers, and this has a strong upside if you happen to be playing a deck that's relevant.
So yeah, check it out.
Another mono black aggro. I mean, I don't play that deck, so I don't know where the cutoff is.
Yeah.
But I do think that it's important to note that unlike other older black cards with similar drawbacks, this card doesn't force you to sacrifice it if you can't discard a card.
So if it's your last card that you're casting, you can ignore the drawback.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be a 2-for-1.
And all the mono black players, I know how much you hate Obstinate Baloth is your greatest enemy. This can't be blocked by Obstinate Baloth. So
yeah.
That's going to feel good, if not be good.
It's good in the Zombie Tribal deck.
Is that a thing yet?
Even though if you're not playing Zombie Tribal, this is still seems like a pretty strong card in a black aggro deck.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to kill. It has evasion. That's all the things you want.
Yeah.
So, this is a bigger test of Delirium. It's not a thing that you want to play without Delirium.
Yeah, Delirium is an interesting mechanic in the set that I feel that most decks are not going to get to. Or at the very least, not easily or not before the long late game. Lands people can usually get because just about everybody plays fetch lands. And some combination of instant sorcery and creature is manageable.
Yeah.
But actually getting to all 3 of those card types at once is not something you're going to rush to unless you're some weird self-milled.
Now, we're used to counting card types in both graveyards for Tarmogoyf.
Yeah.
This is only in your graveyard.
As a Tarmogoyf player, I'm used to counting my card types and having a 3/4 Tarmogoyf. Plus whatever my opponent is giving me.
Which is just bonus.
Yeah, having 3 card types is easy. Having 4...
That's a high bar.
Does require some work, and without most of the Delirium cards in the set, if you don't trigger Delirium, they're just terrible.
This looks saucy on the without Delirium because you're thinking, oh, they might sacrifice a Planeswalker, but remember they're only going to do that
if it's better for them than sacrificing their Merit Lodge or their Consecrated Sphinx or whatever. Giving your opponent options is always bad.
Yeah, so don't hope that they're going to mistakenly sacrifice their Planeswalker when they should have sacrificed a creature. This card is deceptive. It looks exciting, but it's very doubtful that you're playing a deck that's going to get consistently Delirium. If you are, then this is good. but really consider it, and it's harder than you think.
I'm skeptical if it's actually that good, even with Blooms. I feel like this is the kind of an effect that you want to be playing early.
Right.
And I mean, we've had multiple other 3-mana edict effects, and
Sure.
none of them see play. And the upside on this is just so marginal that I don't think it's worth the effort. So first of all, don't read this card's text. It's just a 1-mana 2/1.
We thought we should mention another 1-mana 2/1.
Yeah. So everyone went crazy for this card.
Yeah, it's because it's crazy good.
In one particular deck, it is very good. Don't try to shoehorn this thing in where it doesn't belong. This thing is not going to draw you that many cards.
It's confusing because it looks like a card drawing
It's
card.
not a card advantage engine.
No, it is a 3-mana 3/2 menace. Play it if you want that. Very occasionally, it might deal damage to somebody. That should not be expected.
Yeah, the deck that wants to play this is the mono red aggro burn thing, where most of its spells are 1 and 2 mana. So it's maybe a 4/2 menace.
The thing is, though, that even a crazy good 3-drop is very hard to fit into that deck because it can't afford to play very many 3-drops at all. Its 3-drops tend to deal 8 damage.
Yeah.
Like Sulfuric Vortex and Hell's Thunder. For this to deal 8 damage, the stars really have to align. So, as good as this card is, I don't think it maybe even has a home in Highlander.
Yeah, I think that people are going to try and play it because they want to draw extra cards, and they're going to be very disappointed.
Yeah. It's not what you think it is.
Storm.
Yeah.
Next.
Yeah. Here you go, Storm players.
I don't necessarily know that this card is going to be good enough for Highlander. I considered it briefly for my deck and decided it's not going to make the cut, but it is one of the 2 cards in the set that says land cards go to a graveyard from anywhere, and that's not something that has been printed much on Magic cards before, so I know some people are excited about the notion of trying to build a deck around that. Titania, get Rog, Crawling Sensation, bit of Self-Mill, fetch lands, get as much value out of every land as you can. I don't know how good that deck would be. I'm excited to see it when Surge builds it. I don't...
But it's specifically for a certain type of deck that may or may not exist.
Yeah, I mean, this one has reasonable up. I mean, if you can make a 1/1 with it every turn, getting a 1/1 for 3 mana is sort of like a Planeswalker.
It's very different than consistently knowing you'll be able to get a 1/1 every turn.
The self-mill, the optional self-mill is nice because it has synergy with Sylvan Library and Sensei's Top.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to mill yourself, so... I feel like it has a lot of nice upsides that synergize well with a lot of other cards. It's just, it doesn't have enough raw power on its own. But if it had a synergistic shell to go into it, it might be a card.
Definitely a deck building component.
Yeah. This is very similar to that white double face card. It's a bear.
It's a bear.
But it's got a lot of words on it, and they're all good words.
Yeah. So, it's a bear that's going to maybe draw you some cards, right?
Green bear decks like drawing cards. That's often a hard thing for them to do. And the nice thing about the cheap werewolves is that they're often easier to flip because your opponent... It's often hard for your opponent to cast spells from turn 2 onward if they didn't know that was the game plan.
Right.
They want to play a tap land or leave up a counter spell or something, and then suddenly you've got a 3/3 that's ramping you.
Interesting.
This card goes in 2 separate directions. It can be late game card advantage or early game ramp and aggro, but...
So it's more likely to flip in the early game and more likely to draw cards in the late game.
Yeah. But both of those things are good, and it's kind of good. Unlike most cards that have choices, this one seems like it's going to be whichever one you want most. Now, this is my favorite card in the set.
This card is decent stats already. Just look at the body.
Yep, 3 mana 3/2. It's acceptable.
It's acceptable.
This is one of the investigate cards that requires the least amount of effort to actually get clue tokens out of it. You should be playing a land every turn, so you should be getting a clue token every turn. And if you're playing fetch lands, you can get 2 lands. Maybe you fetch land and then play a Secure Tribelter or something. Getting 3 clue tokens in a turn from a green deck with this is not unreasonable. Not every turn, but...
and like you were saying earlier, the clues are better in, for example, green, which has trouble drawing cards.
Especially a green ramp deck, because the time you're going to get the most clues on this is when you've hit all your ramp and acceleration and have nothing to do with all your mana.
This specifically solves a problem that green decks have all the time.
Yeah.
And the only tool they've ever had to solve that problem is Harmonize.
Yes.
This is a second Harmonize.
And so this card would be fine if all it did was just give you something to do with your excess mana later in the game when you need it. But it also can very rapidly become a sizable threat by itself. And because you can sacrifice the clues instant speed, it also has threat of activation. If you play Tireless Tracker on turn 3, and turn 4 you play a fetch land, get 1 clue, you've got 4 mana up, you attack with your 3/2 into an opposing 3/3.
They can't block it because it can turn into a 5/4.
Yeah. So you don't even need to do anything with it. You can just attack and then play some more spells. It's a very flexible card, and it gives a lot of late game advantage to decks that want more to do with their mana without having to play 6 and 7 drops.
And just to circle back, if you think this all sounds like a lot of hoops to jump through, the worst case scenario is a 3 mana 3/2.
And unless you're playing it on turn 3, it's almost guaranteed to be a 3 mana 3/2 that gives you a clue token.
So the worst case scenario is it trades with something. Holds down the fort, or it starts attacking right away.
Yeah,
don't worry about the clues if you don't think you'll be able to get a lot of use out of it. Just getting a little bit use out of it is actually a great deal. This
Yeah, it's
is
almost
a
certainly
very,
going to be a
very
2 for
strong
1.
card. Yeah.
So this card, I don't think that this card is good enough to be played in Highlander.
Why did you want to talk about this one?
Because this is a card like Oath of Nissa from the previous set that is showing a new direction that green is starting to go in that we haven't seen before. Which green is starting to get a lot more of these ponder effects with enough card types listed on them that make them actually good. Green has for quite some time had the 2 mana, look at the top, X, get a creature or a land. But that's never been comparable to Ponder or Impulse because blue has just been able to take anything at once. Green has started to get these cards that allow you to get any permanent type, which some decks still want to be able to get spells, but any permanent type is a lot more flexible, and we're starting to see green really move into the cheap cantrip area in ways that are actually reasonable. So I don't think that this card necessarily gets played, but I think that that's just something for green deck builders to bear in mind. You've never really considered playing these ponders before, but just pay attention because this may be a new element of your curve and of your deck building that is worth thinking about.
Interesting. So is this card worth it? Is there a deck that wants this?
I feel like there are 3 cards that you can compare this to. If we were on MTG spoiler, they'd be the 3 suggested cards.
Yeah, Mythic Spoiler as suggestions.
That are always very on point.
Yeah.
One is Vindicate, which this is not.
Right.
No. I mean, people want this to be an instant speed Vindicate.
It's really not.
It says non-land, so that's relevant.
Yeah.
I mean, Maelstrom Pulse, I can attest, is still very good, even if you can't hit lands. Another comparison is Utter End, which is 1 mana more for the same effect, without the life loss.
Yeah.
And Utter End, correct me if I'm wrong, doesn't see any play in Highlander.
Not that I've seen.
Some very fringe play. The difference between 3 and 4 mana is huge. And then the last card that I compare it to is Ulcerate, which is 1 black mana, -3/3, and lose 3 life.
Right.
Which also trades 1 mana for 3 life on effects that sometimes see play, but Ulcerate also doesn't see play because if you want to kill something cheaply, losing 3 life is a very steep cost to pay.
Right. If you're trying to kill their threats, then probably you don't have the life to pay.
On the other hand, those very cheap removal spells are pretty much isolated to being used against aggro decks where you can't afford to pay the life. This is a lot more flexible in that it can be used at instant speed to exile a Planeswalker, a 6 mana creature, a combo piece.
So in a control mirror, this is nice to have against their Consecrated Sphinx.
I think that it is versatile enough to consider. The 3 life is certainly a significant drawback that will have to be considered against aggro decks. On the other hand, against a combo deck or a control mirror, 3 life is probably not a big deal.
To me, as a control player, I don't see ever considering this card because 3 life is so huge against the mono red decks and the quick aggro decks. It's always going to be a dead card. You're not even going to want to cast it on the creature. So to me, I'm going to always say no to this.
I think it has more versatility than you might be giving it credit for.
Fair enough.
And now we get into the Planeswalkers.
Yeah.
I'm disappointed in here.
Yeah, I mean, so it's +2 doesn't do anything. It doesn't give you card advantage and it doesn't affect the board. Those are the 2 things that are things.
The Planeswalkers need to do.
That any card needs to do is give card advantage or affect the board. It's -2 only affects things that have already done something. It's embarrassing. Neither of its 2 abilities that you can use right off affect the board immediately at all.
And although it's never normally a consideration for Planeswalkers, I find it a little embarrassing that she can... It takes a reasonable length of time to get to her ultimate, and her ultimate doesn't really do anything either.
Yeah, this card is just an embarrassment, and please don't play it in any deck. I'm sorry. So right off the bat, its stats are okay.
Yeah, 3 mana 3/3 flyer in a color combination that doesn't typically get too much evasion.
Right.
Discarding a card when you play another creature is a reasonable cost, but this is again the color combination that I was going to have an excess land or maybe a Gravecrawler or something that they don't care about.
Exactly. And basically, you're often going to be discarding that card for an extra 3 or 4 damage.
Yeah.
That's really significant. Discarding a card for damage is already what the aggro decks are doing. That's not considered card disadvantage.
So definitely consider this card in a black-red aggro deck.
And the vampire deck.
Of course.
So, what is Arlen Cord? I don't really understand. There's just so many floopy. It feels like one of those underground Mario levels, you know?
So I think that there's a couple of different modes that Arlen's going to be on. The default mode, because it's the easiest to figure out, is you're going to play her and make a wolf, just like Xenagos or Garrett Relentless, a 4-mana Planeswalker that makes a 2/2.
Okay.
That's fine. And then next turn, instead of doing that again, you're going to Lightning Bolt something. Which is
that's the thing I wanted to do anyway.
Totally comparable to making a 2/2.
Yep.
And then next turn, you're going to make a 2/2 again.
And
then you're going to Lightning Bolt again.
And now we're at 1 loyalty.
Eventually, and then you make a wolf again, and then eventually you pump something. But
that's so far down the line. We've made 3 wolves and bolted 2 things.
Yeah, maybe we just bolt a 3rd thing, and then you get. If that's your game plan, this card is going to be fine.
Right.
However, if you drop Arlen Cord and decide that that's not what you want to really get in there with a creature, you can give something. I don't really see her using her +1 too much when she comes down that turn, but...
Well, unless they have a 3/3 on the board and she wants to defend herself, and that's really interesting, because you can give your 2/2, +2/+2 vigilance and haste, attack, and then...
I mean, you're still chump blocking then with your...
But the 3/3 can't block, and so now suddenly you've got your 2/2 in that turn. That's really relevant. Often, she's going to be next to a pint-sized creature, and +1ing puts her to 4, meaning a 3/3 can't crack her back and kill her. So there's these lots of room for play. There's so many options on this card.
I suppose the other reason that you might want to choose not to flip her right away is that she does give the creature haste as well. So next turn you play a creature, give it +2/+2 vigilance and haste, and you're getting it for a lot of damage. This card has so many abilities, and you have so much control over which ones you get to have access to, that she has got to be good, at the very least, in a sort of mid-range shell. I could totally accept that she may be too slow for a real aggro deck. She's not... If you're topping your curve with Arlen, she's not killing your opponent right away.
It's true, but she's whatever you want her to be in exactly the board state that you happen to be in. It's very, very useful to have all those options. Take it from a blue player, red-green players. You love options. They feel great. This is your first time.
Don't forget, red-green players don't care so much about options. They just care about killing people.
Well, this will do that too.
It does take a little while to do this, so it's not an auto-include in every red-green deck.
If you can afford the 4 mana and you think you might be going a little longer, this card is going to show a lot of strength.
Yeah.
So this is 6 mana.
6 mana Planeswalkers are a thing that people can play.
Yeah. Yep.
And
normally I play 6 mana Planeswalkers if they make 3 creatures.
Yeah, Sorin doesn't
Wrath the board.
doesn't have a huge impact on the board.
Oftentimes, if they have a threat, Sorin's going to need to immediately minus X, which might be like -4 maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Put himself immediately to 2. It's just such dicey territory. And furthermore, the kinds of decks that want to be playing 6 mana Planeswalkers, the +1 that domes them for life, you're not caring about doming them for life. You just want the card.
Mm-hmm.
So a 6 mana card drawing engine is not good. A 6 mana removal spell isn't good. I don't know.
Yeah, I certainly don't feel like Sorin is the greatest of the Planeswalkers. Speaking from experience, I can imagine someone just playing him because he's another Planeswalker.
Sure.
But
if you want another 6 mana Planeswalker and Staff of Nin just isn't your jam, then Sorin maybe gets in.
But he's certainly not going to be the first pick.
No doubt.
Wow, this card's a green-black card. I must be playing this in my Highlander deck.
Bad news for you, Alasdair.
This is a 5-mana creature that doesn't do anything.
It just doesn't do anything.
No, wait, sorry, it does. It makes me sacrifice my lands. So, to be fair, people have been discussing also, like I said earlier on Crawling Sensation, the possibility of a green-black deck that interacts with its lands.
Sure, a deck that does nothing. Now, if you're trying to do nothing, a card that doesn't do anything, it's like peanut butter and jelly. But if your deck is planning on doing things, this card doesn't do anything. It's a vanilla creature.
The turn after it comes into play, it can let you sacrifice a land to draw a card.
Okay. Remind me where there's a We've been over this before. Cards that don't generate card advantage and don't impact the board aren't good. This is a 5 mana 6/6. Would you play a vanilla 5 mana 6/6? No. No deck would. No. Unless you're going infinite with this guy. And if that's your jam, power to you. But otherwise, this is a terrible card.
Sorry, it's not great.
So there's a new cycle of lands in the set. Do you have basic land types in your deck? If so...
Well, I think that might be misleading because these lands comes into play tapped lands unless you already have lands in your hand.
Yeah.
So I think they're highly comparable to the Scars of Mirrodin fast land cycle.
Mm-hmm.
The chances of you being able to play this untapped on turns 1, 2, and 3 are all very good.
Yep.
Turn 4, it starts to get a little sketchy, and then after that, this is never a land that you're going to draw when you need a land, and then use it to cast your 5-drop or your 6-drop.
Absolutely true. So, decks that intend to still be using all their mana every turn on turns 4, 5, 6, 7, any control deck or ramp deck.
You don't want this.
These lands are just a terrible top deck.
But any aggro deck that wants to be playing lands and tapping them on the first 3 turns and
aggro decks with tight mana restrictions.
I think that these lands are going exactly the same decks as the decks that are playing the Mirrodin fast lands.
Good assessment. And our last card for our review.
This is my other favorite card of the set.
Who isn't excited about this? Flying Lifelink Indestructible Haste 9/7. Everyone likes it.
People have been playing Maritlage for ages, and honestly, this card has the same clock as Maritlage. It has haste, so it gets them turn faster.
It's nuts.
I think that if this land...
you don't just get to cast the 9/7 for 0?
Yeah, sorry, this is the same card. They're not 2 separate cards.
Oh, okay. Alright, there's a little restriction.
Yeah, so the land here, I think if it just had the transform ability, sacrificing 5 creatures is a very steep cost. That basically just token decks and control decks whose win con are Planeswalkers that make tokens.
Even then.
It's really maybe an elf deck
Sure.
because they play land
Sure.
shooters.
Yep,
They
yep,
have
yep.
a bunch of 1/1s that they aren't doing anything with after turn 3.
But most decks with lots and lots of creatures, you don't want to be playing 5 creatures out because that's called overextending.
Yeah,
You're
I
gonna
think
get
that I think that a token deck or an elf deck are about the only decks that could legitimately play this card just on the expectation of flipping it.
Sure, but
And control decks that want some kind of late game finishing effect don't want the 5 mana Pale Life get a 1/1. It's so slow and it doesn't affect the board meaningfully at all.
yeah.
Honestly, getting some 1/1s late in the game is nice, but pretty meaningless.
When's the last time someone played Urza's Factory?
Yeah. However, because this card gives you something to do with the tokens you make, and gives you tokens to reduce the cost, quite frankly, I'm imagining this to be a card you play on the board when you have 3 creatures, which is reasonable. You make a token, you make a token.
Right. Now, often, if you have 3 creatures and you start activating this, that threat of getting the 9/7 is enough to freak people out, and they're going to have to start killing your creatures. But just forcing them to kill your creatures when they weren't planning on doing that.
When the creatures that you have in play are a Trinket Mage or a Birds of Paradise, a couple of Spirit tokens, and then this thing that you made, someone wraths my Birds of Paradise and a couple of Elf tokens. That's great!
Right. So this card forces your opponent to do weird plays. It gives you control. And all that on a land. So this isn't taking a spell slot. If you can afford to put a land in your deck that adds a colorless mana...
Every deck can afford a few colorless lands. You just need to make the decision about which are the most important. Obviously, any fast deck doesn't care about this at all, but a slower... I think either an Elf strategy or a slower control deck that has ways to produce tokens, like Planeswalkers, Bitter Blossoms, Lingering Souls, anything like that. If you can incidentally get 3 creatures on the board and 6 mana, you should probably consider playing this card.
So, that's our review for...
Shadows over Innistrad.
Shadows over Innistrad.
Overall, it's an exciting looking set, and I'm really pleased with how many cards hint at the possibility of new Highlander decks that haven't quite had the power before to see play.
Yeah, absolutely. Get brewing.
Yeah. Thanks for watching, everybody.